Now, the payment system Bitcoin has attracted attention and controversy since it was launched about 5 years ago. Is it a currency, a commodity, or a service? Its legal status is still not clearly defined. But should authorities be wary of it? What are the real benefits of using it? Experts from all over the world met here in Singapore over the past 2 days for a conference to tackle these questions and more. I chatted with one of the speakers, digital currency expert Zenon Kapron, and started by asking him to spell out how Bitcoin works.
Bitcoin is really the world's first virtual currency insofar that it's decentralized. So basically all of the transactions that happen within Bitcoin are stored on a public ledger that's shared by everybody. If you think about the Singapore dollar or the US dollar, there's a central bank and there are banks that control the transaction flow. Bitcoin is completely decentralized as everything's in the internet and everything's in the cloud. So the transactions are publicly recorded and transacted that way. So there's no kind of middleman in the transaction process.
So you mentioned that there's no single authority governing the whole system, and every transaction is recorded in a public ledge called the blockchain. How does it compare, though, with more traditional forms of payment? And is it a double-edged sword, ensuring transparency, yet potentially it could be quite volatile?
Now, decentralization, as you mentioned, has pluses and minuses. I mean, the positives are that the fees are very low because there's no bank that's standing in the middle. The challenge is right now, especially, is it's not regulated. So there's the challenge of do you trust that network? And so there's a lot of trust that's built into the network. And right now, a lot of volatility. So when you look at the price of Bitcoin versus the US dollar or versus other currencies, it's quite volatile as of late.
Zenon, let's talk about Bitcoin adoption in Asia. It's not very popular as yet. Why do you think this is the case?
Bitcoin adoption globally is very low right now. To a certain extent, Bitcoin is a solution for a problem that we haven't found yet. I mean, it is a very elegant technical solution, but it hasn't gotten to the point where it's very easy for the people to use. I use the example of the mother test. Is it easier to use for somebody like my mother who's not very technology savvy? Right now, when she goes to buy groceries, when she goes to buy a coffee, she uses a credit card and she can swipe, she doesn't have to sign, it's very quick, it's very easy, it's almost easier than cash. The Bitcoin solutions or the payment solutions that are based on Bitcoin just really aren't there yet. So it's going to be a while before that gets to the point that people really want to use it. On the corporate side of things, there's lots of usage within the financial industry and within other industries as well. But the usage models, and it's going to take a while for somebody to be the first one to move in a lot of these spaces.
Now, you mentioned just now that Bitcoin essentially is a solution to a problem that we haven't really met yet. Do you think that sort of disincentivizes businesses and individuals to start adopting it?
The incentives for adopting Bitcoin really vary on the market. So in certain markets like China, which we cover, the merchant fees, essentially the fees that a merchant would pay to accept a credit card, are very low. They're between 0 and 2–3%. In other markets, the merchant fees could be much higher, between 2 and 5%, depending on. So Bitcoin is very cheap, but in certain markets, not very competitive. I mean, if you're paying 0.5%, then the added trouble of accepting Bitcoin may not be worth it in that case.
Zenon, let's zoom in on Singapore and the usage of Bitcoin here. What do you think is holding businesses back from this adoption?
Accepting Bitcoin is very quick and easy. It can be used on a mobile phone, it can be used on a computer, just scanning a QR code. So the setup costs are very low. The challenge for a lot of the merchants, though, is volatility. Volatility versus the Singapore dollar. In many cases, merchants are buying in Singapore dollars, and then if they're selling in Bitcoins, their inputs are still in Singapore dollars. So there's quite a bit of FX risk that goes on the back of that if Bitcoin moves against them.
Now, there's also been a lot of concern, isn't it, that Bitcoin can be vulnerable to criminal activities. How real do you think such a concern is?
It's, in my opinion, like any other currency. Bitcoin is actually not anonymous and is one of the more traceable forms. If I take $1,000 out of the US and if those bills aren't marked, they kind of disappear. But with Bitcoin, there's always a trace because of this public ledger of at least where the coins are going. Now, the question of who's behind that it needs a little bit more investigation, but with a lot of these companies that are setting up AML practices and know your customer practices to prevent anti-money laundering issues, we're getting a lot more clarity into where the transactions are going. So in certain cases, Bitcoin is actually more advantageous than regular currencies in terms of traceability.
Zenon, let's look ahead now. How much of a take-up rate do you think the Bitcoin is going to receive globally in the future?
Bitcoin is really a binary outcome. It's either going to be worth a lot and be used by everybody, or worth very little and used by a certain subset of people just as kind of an enthusiast currency. I think the technology behind Bitcoin, this idea of the blockchain and the distributed network, it's very few technologies have that much potential impact on the industry. So I think whether Bitcoin is here or not, the technology behind it is very powerful and has many different applications, not just in the financial industry, but looking at any kind of distributed assets in the market.